September 18, 1944. Near the German border, in a dimly lit command post, General Hassan Montefiore stared at a map that promised something he hadn't felt in months: victory. At 51 years old, Montefiore was no fanatic. He was a pragmatist, a master of armored warfare who had survived the brutal campaigns of Russia and North Africa. He had watched armies collapse. He knew the Wehrmacht was bleeding out under his command sat the 113th cold morning Panzer Brigade. He believed he finally held the winning hand. The shattered remnants of Normandy divisions barely held together by desperate prayers. This was Hitler's new fire brigade. Fresh formations shipped directly from the factories. The tanks were so new that some crews were still learning how to operate their turret mechanisms. The brigade was equipped with 58 brand new Panther tanks, the deadliest predators on this Western Front, Montefiore calculated with cold precision. The American Sherman was reliable, yes, but it was a medium tank with a 75mm gun. Its frontal armor could be penetrated by a Panther from 2,000 meters away. The Panther's sloped armor could bounce American shells like ping-pong balls. The Panther's gun could kill a Sherman from distances where the American gun was merely ineffective. He studied the fuel calculations. The 113th Brigade had been allocated 600,000 liters of fuel, enough for 2 days of intensive operations. 2 days. That was all he needed. His objective was elegant in its simplicity: slice into the exposed right flank of General George Patton's Third Army. Patton was overextended. His fuel line stretched across 400 kilometers, his tanks scattered across 180 kilometers of front. Montefiore's plan was to concentrate his 58 Panthers and punch directly at the American 4th Armored Division. Cut off Patton's spearheads, destroy them in detail. Create a crisis that would force the Americans to halt their entire advance. By every conventional military calculation, this should have worked. The German tanks were superior. The German numbers were concentrated. The element of surprise was absolute. The Americans had no idea a fresh Panzer Brigade was assembling in the fog and forests of Lorraine. But Montefiore was making calculations based on 1940 logic, in a 1944 reality. He assumed a tank battle was decided by armor thickness and gun caliber. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that he was leading his elite brigade into a trap constructed from three things the German military mind simply could not comprehend. September 19th, 7:30 a.m. The lead elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade began their approach, marched toward their assembly areas, and then nature intervened. A thick, heavy fog rolled across the Lorraine fields like a living thing. Visibility dropped to 50 yards. Then 30 yards. Tank commanders peered desperately through periscopes. Drivers could barely see the tank in front of them. Montefiore's greatest advantage: the long-range killing power of the Panther's 75mm cannon, instantly evaporated. A 2,000-meter kill shot requires sight. These Panthers couldn't see 50 meters. The fire brigade was blind, and somewhere in that fog, something was waiting. 15 kilometers away, inside the American Combat Command headquarters, Colonel Bruce Clark received the first reports from forward observers. Heavy engine noise, large formations, moving west. Clark didn't have heavy tanks. What he had was the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a name that would one day adorn America's main battle, tank. Abrams didn't panic. He realized instantly that the fog was an equalizer, a catastrophic one. If the Germans couldn't see at 2,000 yards, their superior guns were useless. This was going to be a knife fight in a phone booth. Speed and reaction time were everything. The German column advanced through the mist, tank engines roaring, tracks clanking. Commanders hunched in their cupolas. They expected to crush the American picket line and break into the rear. The lead Panther suddenly erupted in flames. The turret exploded outward. Then the second Panther in column. Then the third. The German crews panicked. Radio discipline collapsed. Tank commanders slewed their turrets left and right, desperately searching for muzzle flashes in the fog. But there were none visible. The shots were hitting them from the flanks, punching through the thinner side armor. Rounds that couldn't penetrate the thick glacis plate were tearing through the weaker sides like paper. German voices crackled over the radio in confusion. Enemy to the left. No. Enemy right. Where is the enemy? Commanders popped their hatches to see through the mist, only to be cut down by unseen machine gun fire. The German commanders assumed they had run into a massive wall of American heavy tanks. But the reality was far more disturbing. The 113th Panzer Brigade hadn't hit a wall. They had walked into a swarm. Enter the M18 Hellcat tank destroyer. To a German tanker, the Hellcat was almost a joke. It had virtually no armor. A heavy machine gun could penetrate its thin turret. It had leaving the crew exposed to shrapnel and grenades. By Wehrmacht standards, which valued protection above all else, it was a suicide machine. But the M18 had one statistic that Montefiore had completely ignored in his calculations: power-to-weight ratio. The Hellcat weighed only 17 tons. Despite that minimal weight, it was powered by a radial aircraft engine, the same type that powered American fighter planes. This engine produced 350 horsepower. It could achieve road speeds of 55 miles per hour, faster than any tank in the world. No Panther, no Tiger, no Soviet T-34 could match that speed. The Hellcat could relocate from one position to another faster than a medium tank could rotate its turret. In the fog of Aricourt, this speed became the German Panthers advanced in a rigid phalanx like Roman legionaries in formation. They were designed to advance in coordinated groups, supporting each other's flanks. But coordinated tactics require visibility and communication. The fog destroyed both. The American Hellcats fought like a pack of wolves. Individual hunters, autonomous, coordinated not by proximity but by radio. And the killing had only just begun. Here's how the engagement unfolded, repeated dozens of times that morning. A Hellcat platoon from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion would hear the Panthers approaching through the fog. The commander, listening on the radio, would plot their position on the map. He would order his driver to race to a flank position hidden behind a hedgerow or barn. The engine would scream at full throttle. The crew would deploy into firing positions. Then they would wait, engines idling. Gunner with hand on the firing mechanism. Loader with armor-piercing rounds staged for rapid reload. They would wait until the German behemoths rolled past, exposing their vulnerable sides. 3 high-velocity 76mm rounds would slam into the side of a Panther. Penetration. Fire. The Panther's turret would slew left, trying to engage the Hellcat. But the Hellcat was already moving. The driver would reverse at full throttle. The vehicle would back up 300 yards at near maximum speed, guided by the commander shouting directions. They would relocate 300 yards down a different road, across different terrain, toward the next ambush position. Before the surviving German tanks could complete their turret rotation, the Hellcats had vanished. It was a clash of philosophies. The Germans built tanks as armored fortresses, heavy, protected, designed to take a hit and survive. The Americans built vehicles to never be there when the hit arrived, light, mobile, designed to shoot and relocate. By noon, the fog began to lift. Montefiore, receiving reports of stalled attacks and mounting losses, ordered his commanders to push harder. The Americans cannot be everywhere. Push through their screen. But as the sun burned off the mist, the Germans realized the second part of the American trap had just closed. During the opening hours, the German infantry, the Panzer Grenadiers, had ridden on the backs of the tanks or followed closely in half-tracks to protect the armor from American infantry. Suddenly, as the fog lifted, the sky above Aricourt tore open. It wasn't airplanes, not yet. It was something far more precise, something the German mind could not fathom. The American artillery, specifically the 66th Armored Field Artillery Battalion under Colonel Bruce Clark's direct command, was executing a tactic that was standard doctrine for the 4th Armored Division, but a weapon of shocking lethality. Time on target. In traditional 1940s warfare, artillery batteries fired sequentially. Battery A would fire. The enemy would hear the first shell approaching. They would react. They would dive into foxholes. Battery B would fire 10 seconds later, but by then the enemy was already underground. The surprise was lost. The American time on target system was revolutionary. It was pure mathematics. A centralized fire direction center would calculate the flight time of artillery. Shells from 12 different batteries positioned miles apart at different elevations at different distances from the target. The FDC would then calculate backward from a specific impact time what firing time each battery required. Battery A, positioned 12 kilometers away, would fire at 12 o'clock hours. Battery B, positioned 4 kilometers away, would fire at 12:05. Battery C, positioned 8 kilometers away, would fire at 12:10. The mathematics was precise. The ballistic tables were accurate. Every gun fired at a different moment, but every single shell arrived at the target coordinates at the exact same instant. When the fog lifted on September 19th, Piper Cub spotter planes, tiny observation aircraft that looked like overgrown insects, circled overhead above the 113th Brigade positions. The pilots could see the German tank columns below. They called down coordinates. They became the eyes of the American artillery system. For the 113th Panzer Brigade, there was no warning, no ranging shots. 1 second, the Panzer Grenadiers were advancing across a muddy field. The next second, the air above them simply disintegrated. Dozens of airburst shells detonated simultaneously at 30 feet altitude. The effect was apocalyptic. Shrapnel fell like razor-sharp rain. The blast waves were lethal. The Panzer Grenadiers, elite infantry, were decimated. Dozens died in the initial salvo. Dozens more were wounded. The shrapnel didn't scratch the Panthers' armor, but it stripped the Panthers of something far more valuable: their eyes and ears. External radios destroyed. Radio antennas mangled. Telephone lines severed. Command and control disintegrated instantly. The German tanks were stripped of their defensive perimeter. They were buttoned up hatches, closed, commanders blind, isolated in the explosions. A blind tank without infantry support is a dead tank. Montefil's elite brigade wasn't engaged in a battle. It was being processed by a machine. By the afternoon of September 19th, the battlefield was littered with burning Panthers. But the most shocking statistic wasn't the tanks destroyed by fire. It was the tanks that simply stopped. The 111th Panzer Brigade, supposed to support the 113th Brigade's attack, arrived late. Why? Because they ran out of fuel on the way to the battle. Germany had designed the most sophisticated tank in history. Precision optics superior to anything the Americans possessed. Interleaved road wheels. Superior sloped armor. High-velocity cannon. But they couldn't produce the liquid fuel to move 58 of these machines 20 kilometers. General Patton was screaming about fuel shortages. American tank units were rationing fuel. But here's the fundamental difference. When Americans lacked fuel, tanks turned off their engines and waited for trucks. When trucks arrived, tanks refueled and resumed operations within hours. When Germans lacked fuel, the tank was abandoned. Crews dynamited the gun breech, disabled the engine. The tank was left to rust in the mud. As the battle raged over 3 days, the disparity became almost comical. American recovery crews towed damaged Shermans back to mobile repair depots during the battle. Tank mechanics working in outdoor workshops and combat zones were welding patches over shell holes. Tanks knocked out in the morning would refuel, recrew, and return to the line by evening. The Germans had no recovery vehicles. If a Panther threw a track, abandoned. Transmission failed, abandoned. Engine caught fire, the crew bailed and the tank burned. The final tally was brutal. The 113th Panzer Brigade entered the battle with 58 brand new Panther tanks. By the end of the week, only 8 remained operational. American losses? Approximately 25 tanks and tank destroyers, replaced within days. Air proved that a superior weapon is rendered absolutely useless if it's blind, unsupported, unable to move, and outmaneuvered by swarms of lighter vehicles operating with superior coordination and logistics. The Germans built warrior knights in shining armor. The Americans built a factory that moved at 50 miles per hour. A factory with radios, supply trucks, spare engines, ammunition, and fuel. And in September 1944, in the fog of Lorraine, the factory won.